And I say this with a lot of anger and hurt myself because I don't think anybody loves this country more than I do. But the fact is that the complete structural integrity of Pakistan is at stake. Your inflation has soared to unprecedented heights. Your unemployment is at an all-time high. The legal system has never been more compromised before. Your politics has descended into something you don't see anywhere else in the world. Your salaried class is burnt out, exhausted, they don't know where to go. The level of grads being produced by your education system, at least the majority of them, are not at par with the world. There's energy crisis, there's human capital crisis, there's climate crisis. In order to understand this crisis or the economic situation, we need to understand Pakistan's geographical significance because this has a huge role to play in it. Pakistan's strategic importance for the world lies in its geography. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and of course, the US had to respond. So they couldn't do it without Pakistan again because of the same golden spot. Warlords who had been part of the same tribe but been part of the same force against the Soviets turned against each other, plunging Afghanistan into a civil war. And this is the time Pakistan realized that this is going to be a big mess because a lawless neighbor is always a threat, but lawless neighbor is a bigger threat when you share an extremely complicated geography with them. The Durand Line border, spanning 2,430 kilometers from the snow-capped Pamir Mountains in the north to the Arabian Sea in the south, traverses a diverse terrain of fertile valleys, deserts, and tribal heartlands. But then happens 9/11. And 9/11 is the time when Pakistan once again comes into spotlight. The US administration holds Osama bin Laden responsible for the 9/11 attacks.
An important battle has been won, but the war continues. The war will be a series of such battles.
You just did not know if you're going to make it back alive. A war that would test the country's resilience, its economy, and its people. According to the National Counter-Terrorism Authority of Pakistan, the human and financial toll of this conflict is staggering.
This is a never-ending war. Pakistan is wasting 90 billion rupees a month on this war. 90 billion a month. Imagine the whole education and health budget of Punjab, which is 100 million people, is about 60 billion. So 90 billion a month is going down the drain on this war.
From 2001 to 2022, Pakistan lost a staggering 83,000 lives to terrorism and incurred a financial loss of over 35 trillion rupees, equivalent to approximately $125 billion, or 37% of Pakistan's current GDP. The conflict also led to a decline in foreign investment, a rise in inflation, and a crippling energy crisis. And if this wasn't enough, came floods. A damage that would cost the economy billions again. All this and more led to the kind of losses that Pakistan did not have the muscle to bear. Your tax base was always limited, your infrastructure was always underdeveloped, and then all these industries started moving out of the country. A trifecta of flawed policy making, unaccountability, and institutional distrust spawned an environment of chronic uncertainty, deterring investment and completely choking economic growth. So Pakistan economy was torn apart, leaving it vulnerable to external shocks and internal strife. So this was a little bit of background of how the crisis began. Now we'll talk about the challenges and the problems that we're faced with currently. The most painful manifestation of Pakistan's economic crisis has been inflation, which peaked at 38% last year in May. As of fiscal year 2024, which ended on June 30th, just 2 months ago, we clocked at 23.4%, which again is massive. And although there have been a lot of factors that have contributed to this, our debt and external liabilities at this point of time are an absolute horror. They have eaten us to the bones. We'll give you a little bit of context of Pakistan's debt composition here, as stated by the United States Institute of Peace. Pakistan's debt landscape is complex, with nearly 77% of its $97.5 billion debt owed directly by the government to various creditors. An additional $7.9 billion is owed by government-controlled public sector enterprises to multilateral creditors. The country's creditors fall into 4 broad categories: multilateral debt, Paris Club debt, private and commercial loans, and Chinese debt. Multilateral debt accounts for roughly $45 billion, out of which we owe the World Bank $18 billion, Asian Development Bank $15 billion, and IMF $7.6 billion. While substantial, this debt poses limited short-term risks due to concessional terms and extended repayment timelines. Then comes Paris Club debt, which totals $8.5 billion, scheduled for repayment over 40 years. Japan, Germany, France, and the US are the primary creditors here. Then comes private debt and commercial loans, which comprise a sizable portion, including $7.8 billion in private bonds, with $2 billion raised in through euro bonds with interest rates ranging from 6% to 8.87%. Commercial loans, mostly from the Chinese financial institutions, amount to nearly $7 billion, with steep terms and high interest rates. Some loans are benchmarked against LIBOR or SHIBOR, such as the recent $2.2 billion loan from the China Development Bank. Chinese bilateral debt stands at around $27 billion, including $10 billion in concessional terms with a 20-year maturity period. Additionally, China SAFE has placed $4 billion in foreign deposits with Pakistan's central bank, and a currency swap facility is also in place. Now, this was a bit of an overview of our payments. Let's talk about the payment terms now. Pakistan faces significant short and medium-term debt repayment pressure with $77.5 billion in external debt due for repayment from April 2023 to June 2026. Major repayments include $25 billion in debt servicing in the next fiscal year, $24.6 billion in debt servicing in the year 25, $23 billion in debt servicing in year 26. In order to manage the debt pressure, Pakistan primarily relies on exports, remittances, and FDI. However, the inflows are projected to fall short of the import bill at the moment. So, in that case, what do you do? Pakistan's economic managers have two options. One, to seek fresh loans and rollovers of debt, pursue preemptive restructuring of debt, which would reduce repayment pressure but involve painful austerity measures. So despite all the inflation, despite all these taxes, despite everything that the common man of this country is doing to get through this, we're sort of stuck between the devil and the deep blue sea. So the question is, what do we do from here? On November 28, 2023, the World Bank came up with a series of policy notes as part of its engagement and outreach to contribute to the ongoing public dialogue about what should Pakistan be doing to get out of this crisis. These policy notes emphasized on reforms focused on 8 themes: strengthening government revenues, rationalizing government expenditures, strengthening institutions for effective implementation, transforming Pakistan's private sector, achieving sustainable energy, improving learning outcomes, reducing child stunting, unleashing the agri-food sector. And although all of these themes have an impact on the economy, we will be going through 4 of them that are more relevant to the discussion that we're doing right now. So we'll start with strengthening government revenues. Pakistan's tax to GDP ratio has been declining, with revenues well short of what could be expected under an optimal tax system. Pakistan's tax capacity has remained largely unchanged, at a little over 22% of GDP over the past decade. Despite this, there has been a longer-term trend of declining collections, with taxes falling from around 14% in the 1980s to around 10 to 12% of GDP now. Now the problem here is that a huge chunk of the tax base is not captured. And why isn't it captured is because Pakistan, unfortunately, has always taken the easy route. And what's the easy route is that it's always sought to meet revenue shortfalls from imposing taxes, more and more taxes to an already compliant segment, the salaried class. The World Bank also says that Pakistan heavily relies on the withholding tax system, whereby it is withholding taxes on even the non-income transactions like the telecommunication and energy payments, which are extremely regressive practices. Nobody else does this. The recommendations now. Number 1, broaden the tax base by including increased taxes on agriculture, retail, and property. Number 2, close distortionary and regressive exemptions on loopholes. Number 3, address regulatory constraints to private sector, including cutting red tape and removing barriers to foreign investment. Number 4, remove the anti-export bias in trade policy, including tariff rationalization and reform of export subsidy schemes. Number 5, address inefficiencies and high costs in the energy sector. Number 6, improve the functionality of the GST. Number 7, support compliance through simplification of tax structures and closing of income tax loopholes. And then the World Bank recommends to tax the rich and wealthy and protect the poor, which obviously is not happening. Then the World Bank suggests to remove exemptions, especially exemptions for power generation projects, which amounted to 37 billion Pak rupee in the fiscal year 21, and exemptions for real estate, which amounted to 26 billion Pak rupee. These savings, according to the World Bank, would be sufficient to fund 35,000 teachers in the average public sector salary over 2/3 of Balochistan's teacher population. Recommendation number 2 from the World Bank is to rationalize government expenditures. Pakistan's persistent and sizable fiscal deficit has actually been the primary driver for macroeconomic instability. To reduce the deficit, it is essential to prioritize expenditures that support economic growth and development. Immediate measures to rationalize fiscal expenditures include: Number 1, refocusing poorly targeted energy and commodity subsidies. Number 2, implementing the Treasury's single account. This will improve effectiveness of government cash management practices, which will in turn enable proper monitoring and accounting of the government's available cash balances and reduce public borrowing needs. Number 3, reforming pensions. Number 4, imposing temporary austerity measures. So they're suggesting setting targets, proposing hiring freeze, a wage freeze for mid and upper sections primarily, halting vehicle purchases, limiting allowances for meetings, travel, fuel, etc. World Bank's recommendation number 3, strengthening institutional effectiveness. The underlying constraints in this area are: Number 1, perverse political economy incentives and elite capture with policy decisions heavily influenced by vested interests, including those of military, political, and business leaders. Number 2, an incomplete devolution agenda that leads to overlaps and gaps in service delivery, increases fiscal costs, and blurs accountability. Number 3, structural and institutional constraints in the public sector, including unclear or duplicative responsibilities and weak incentives for public sector performance. Now, institutional reform is a long-term challenge, and critical measures will have to be taken to, 1, counteract the elite capture and then build the kind of administrative capacity that can deliver that reform. These reforms could include reviving and strengthening institutions for effective national policy coordination between federal and provincial governments to ensure policy coherence and effective implementation. Number 2, improving processes for public sector appointment, performance management, and tenure to enhance incentives for delivery. Number 3, enhancing digitization to improve efficiency and reduce opportunities for corruption. And number 4, increasing e-government transparency through improved availability of information and establishment of performance targets for key government entities. World Bank's recommendation number 4 is about transforming the private sector. Now, Pakistan's growth model is characterized by consumption-driven and import-intensive strategies, which means that we rely so much on the imports that it has made the economy unsustainable. We're hindered by imposing a significant compliance burden on firms, limited access to finance, distorted markets and competition due to a large state presence, heavy trade protections favoring large incumbent firms at the expense of new firms and exporters. The key measures would include: Number 1, enhancing firms' access to finance by reducing government borrowing from the domestic financial sector and improving credit market development institutions. Number 2, simplifying the business environment through coordinated federal and provincial regulatory reform and digitization. Number 3, reducing the state's presence in the economy through SOE reform and selective divestment. Number 4, rationalizing trade tariffs to reduce disincentives to exporting. Number 5, maintaining a flexible and market-determined exchange rate. And number 6, addressing supply and demand side constraints to women's labor force participation. So now the question is, what next? Will we continue down this path of stagnation or finally seize the opportunity and do something about it? Can we afford to ignore these recommendations? Can we afford to dismiss these warnings? What will it take for us to realize that we've actually gone backwards? Questions are clear. The answers, however, are elusive. Will we find them, or will we continue to squander our nation's potential? Give it a thought, guys, and let me know in comments. Allah Hafiz.